Okay, welcome back everyone. We're working out access preferences. I think we're good. Welcome back to the third session of the day, conversations around Latinos and disability in the ADA. We are, I will say, those of you who've just joined us for this session, we are live streaming and eventually it'll be captioned and available off our website. You can find it if you go to the American History page that has all the schedules of what's happening today. We're really happy and excited to have you all here and that we're doing this because it's historic. And so it's great that you're all here sharing it with us. Does everyone see or hear have tactile access? We have volunteers to help out with devices if you need them. We have assistive listening and other services, so let me know and we'll get you set up. The hashtag for all events today is ADA25 and Am History Museum is our museum and I'm Am Hist Curator, should you so desire. So I'm Catherine Ott, and I am very happy and excited to introduce our panelists and who will speak on the topic of activism and advocacy. John McKiernan-Gonzalez, who is a professor of history at Texas State University at San Marcos and a valuable colleague of mine. And we've been doing similar symposia. We started in San Marcos. This one is today, and we're hoping to keep it on the road at Berkeley and Chicago and New York City, based on the history of Latinos and disability is the focus of this. So our panelists, along with John, who will moderate, are Leticia Arellano, who's the founder of Deaf Women of Color, and she is a ASL Proficiency Evaluator at Galludet University. We're really happy she's joining us today. And Horacio Esparza, who's a radio host in Chicago, has a very popular show. And he's the executive director of the Progress Center for Independent Living in Forest Park, Illinois. Chicago is a hopping place for disability activism. So I'm going to turn it over to John, and he will coordinate the conversation. If you have, this is meant to be interactive. So if you have a question throughout the course, if you want to interrupt, that's totally fine. Please go to the microphone, or if you're signing, please come down front so our interpreting team, as well as the audience, can see what you're commenting or asking. So, John.
Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. I am thrilled to be here. And I am actually not worthy of being here, but here I am. Unlike Leticia Arellano and Horacio Fabregas, who deserve this and far more. The topic today, or for this panel, is activism. Activism in all its forms, activism in public, activism in private, ways that people are active that aren't recognized as activism, ways that people do things and it is recognized as activism by other people. It's thinking about intentions, thinking about movements, and thinking about change, and especially people who've been part of change, as Leticia and Horacio both are. As a moderator, I thought I would moderate the conversation, but it turns out I get to ask questions. So the first question I'm going to ask is, how did you become involved in activism? And I'd like to start with Leticia and then Horacio.
Thank you. Well, first, I want to let you know that I know both Mexican Sign Language and American Sign Language. And so I may have a little bit of both languages mixed today. So if you're watching me using sign language, you may not recognize all the signs I use. But first of all, I was born in Juarez, Mexico. And all the members of my family are deaf like me. So within our family, we would have different fiestas. and gatherings of our family coming together. But those fiestas were also places where we had discussions about rights for people with disabilities. I looked at my parents who were leaders in the community, and I watched their discussions. Later, I moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where again, I attended a school for the deaf. I saw teachers and leaders in the school that were deaf like me. And these discussions and things that I had seen had become part of who I am. Then later, I went to Galludet University, where I got involved in more organizations. But honestly, the number of Latinos were very small, and still are today. So we need to see those numbers grow. I think with the ADA, and I could go on, and I know we only have 45 minutes today, so I want to try to keep it as short as possible and make sure I give my other panelists plenty of opportunity to talk. So let me, I'll hold that later comment, and please, Horacio.
Horacio, how did you become an activist?
Thank you, John. First of all, thank you, everybody, and thanks for the Smithsonian for inviting me and be part of this panel. Thank you, Catherine. Good question, John. I always have been a rebel, and when people, and often reporters ask me, you know, when did your advocacy began? When did you start complaining about things that were not fair around you? And I said, right after the next day, after I lose my vision. And where? Within my own family. I wanted to be treated like any other of my brothers or sisters. I remember my mother, in the Latino families, and I think in all families, but especially in the Latino culture, families are very overprotective. And I want to say that that was the first biggest obstacle I found in my life, because I have to be struggling within my own, with my mom, you know, to leave me or let me be independent. I want to say that I lost my vision when I was about 7 years old. Actually, I was in my first 3 months of first grade. So that was interrupted. And after that, my mom didn't want me to go to school, so I started my school again when I was almost 12, 13 years old. So I missed like 5 years of my life going to school because my mom was so afraid that something can happen to me if she would not be around me. So that's how my activism and my advocacy began, against my mom. I have to say, she loves me too much. She loves me a lot, but I have to be fighting with her all the time that I wanted to go to school. And advocacy is not only about accessibility, it's not only about architectural, it's about dignity. And in order you can advocate for everything else, you have to advocate to be treated with dignity. And I remember one time, I was probably 8 years old, like 1 year after I had lost my vision. I remember my sister, one of my sisters that is about 5 years older than me, we were in the park. And I didn't have any friends because I was kind of lonely because about 50 years ago, you was el cieguito del barrio, the little blind in the neighborhood, because no more blind people or no more people with disabilities around. Not that many people with disabilities were visible, because in Latin America or in Mexico at least, families try to hide their people with disabilities in the patio. So I remember one time, my sister and I, we were in the park, and a man came and gave me I think it was like a 5 pesos bill. And I was so happy because he said, you can go and buy a Mexican sandwich, a torta, and a Coca-Cola. And I was so happy about that. But then my sister got so mad, so angry, and she was kind of rude with that man and said, why are you giving my brother money? He's not begging, he's not pleading for money. And he said, well, because I saw he's blind and probably he needs some money. And my sister said, how come you didn't give that money to other, there are so many kids playing around here. And I want to admit that I was kind of upset with my sister because she took that money away from me. But, but later on, years later, I learned that my sister was advocating for my dignity and teaching me to have dignity. Probably if she never have, if she wouldn't have done that, I might be begging, or maybe I would be accepting, anything people would give me. But I learned that I have to have dignity. And now I have to, I appreciate what my sister did back then. And later on, I learned other ways of advocacy in my own neighborhood with my neighbors when they were, I wanted to be included in their games. In Mexico, I don't know how many of you have or live in Mexico or no. In Mexico many years ago, there were different games. Not, children, we didn't have fun with video games and nothing like that exists. The kind of games were, our imaginations and other kind of games on the street, like hiding and throwing the, empty can and you hide while somebody's running, trying to reach the empty can. But anyway, I wanted to be included in those kind of games, so that was my first activism in my community since I was little. And later on, I can talk about my advocacy. When I grew up and when I moved to the United States from Mexico, because that was another level of advocacy here in the United States. Thank you.
I have a comment related to that and dignity. In Mexico, people that can hear and people that speak Spanish, as opposed to the community of the deaf community in Mexico. And again, I mentioned my family is deaf and also Catholic. And when people would come across my parents and they would see that everybody in our family was deaf, they would say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. There must be something that God is doing to your family." And they would point up at the sky. And I know my family often, over the years, would see the same comment over and over again. They would meet people who would tell them, "Well, it must be something that God chose for you and your family." It was considered a sin, like a punishment from God, to have deaf people in our family. And I told my parents, "No, that's not true. We're just normal people." And my parents would say, "Well, no, I actually think they're right. We are being punished." And I actually had to go through talking to my parents about this. And then coming to the US, meeting different deaf people in different organizations here, talking about rights and respect and dignity. And then I would come here and learn that. Then I would go back home and I would talk to my parents again and say, "No, I'm happy that I am deaf. I'm happy that God made us this way." It's a matter of education. It's not just accepting what people think, low expectations, that lack of dignity. It's kind of that grassroots activism, really getting involved and starting there. And I think respect is the starting point for our community.
I want to add, I want to share something.
Also,
sorry.
I don't want to brag, but I've got some family members here, so I'm happy that they're here, and I know that they're being very supportive of me right now, so you might hear some clapping from them.
Horacio,
Oh, sorry.
no, you were going to say something.
There are taboos in our culture, and as Leticia said, people are in Mexico think it's a punishment, is brujeria, and I remember, when I lose my vision, when I had the retinal detachment, my family and friends saying, "Oh, because your grandfather, he was, he had a lot of women and he was cheating your grandmother, and maybe that's why you was punished now, because your grandfather was going to be punished because of that." So, and those are just taboos. But the other thing what Leticia was saying, and I remember my mom, when I first got blind, one day she was having a conversation with with some relatives, and she was so concerned about my disability, what would happen to me in the future if when they would, you know, if someday they would not be here. And I remember my mom saying, well, you know, Horacio doesn't have to worry about it because whatever, you know, properties or we have are going to be for him, and he doesn't need to worry about that. And I remember I was listening behind the doors, and I told my mom, yeah, but you know, house is not enough because I want to grow, I want to have my own family, raise my own children, have my wife, have my own life, and I don't think a house is going to be enough because I would need money. And then she said, don't worry, you know, your brothers and sisters will take care of you, which I don't think so, you know. And then I remember my mom saying, one day she was saying that she was praying so hard because she wanted me to die before her, because she doesn't want to die and knowing that I'm still here and knowing what would going to happen with me. And I remember telling her, you know what, I'm too young. I don't think I should die before you. And you know that. But those are the kind of concerns that our parents and people that love us have. And I think that's where I want to say that's where my advocacy and activism, how it started.
I want to follow up on that, and I want to, you talked about journeys, I guess, journeys to school. You are both immigrants, and you moved to particular places. You moved from Ciudad Juarez, one of the prettiest cities in Mexico, to Santa Fe, one of the most expensive cities in New Mexico, and also pretty, and then here to DC. And you, Horacio, you moved from somewhere in Jalisco?
Actually, from Guadalajara. I was born in Zacatecas, and then my parents moved to Aguascalientes, and that's where I lose my vision. And then I went to a school for blind children, a residential school in Guadalajara.
So if I could ask you first, Leticia, then Horacio, to reflect on the experience of being an immigrant, coming to new places, making new communities, finding ways of being with dignity in these places.
Sure, I can definitely comment on that. That's a very important thing to share. First, my father owned his own business. He made dentures. And living in Juarez at that time, we had a good life. Now, my siblings did not attend school, and neither did I. There was a deaf school in Mexico City, but where we lived in Juarez, there were no schools for deaf kids. My parents, with some friends, were talking about their children. And they said, you know, you're so close to the US, why don't you just go to the US and then you can take classes there and go to a school there. They have services there. But my parents didn't know English and really didn't think that it was really something that they could do. And I would see the kids going to school and other kids in my neighborhood going to school, and I told my parents I really wanted to go to school. And I had no education at that point. My dad, of course, he would go work to support the family. But then after some time, well, during this time, my mother also, she had a limited education, but she really thought that education was very critical for her children. And Dad thought that it was not as important. They talked to folks at the church, and the people in the church said that because they had some connections with my dad making dentures, they knew some people in Santa Fe that did the same kind of work. So this was back in the 1970s. Of course, the expectations and ability to cross the border was different then. So we came to the school, and we came to the US. We met some of the people in Santa Fe. We met different employers there. My dad was was showing that he could make dentures. And one of the employers there was actually really surprised at how well he did, and they wanted to sponsor him to be able to do work at a company in the U.S. I mean, it was kind of like really hitting the lottery at that point, and because we had that sponsorship, we were able to move, but it wasn't easy. Because we moved from a big house to a little mobile home. It was very small. I mean, we had a pretty big family in this very small mobile home. We didn't have friends. We didn't have a support system. My family didn't know English. And we would go to grocery stores, and like at that time there was no pictures of food or anything. So literally, sometimes my mom would go through and try to taste things and try to figure out if this is what she wanted or didn't want. And she knew, of course, the Spanish words for things, but they weren't in the grocery store. So then dealing with people asking all the time whether or not we were there legally. So we, at the same time of moving to the U.S., the government in Mexico found out that my dad had moved to the U.S. and was still trying to operate his business in Mexico too. So he was doing both. Then once that was found out, they shut down his business in Mexico, and the government did. And my mom, he kind of blamed my mom for the problems that we were having because she's the one who wanted to move here. But we were all very excited because we could go to school. And there was a school for the deaf in Santa Fe where the deaf kids, all of us kids could go to school. It was hard, especially the first 5 years. And my dad really went through quite a lot. The school for the deaf required us to write letters to our parents as part of like a homework assignment. And I did that, and so did my brothers and sisters. And my family, when I came home with that letter that day, it was really touching. My dad realized how important education was. It could see that we were learning to write in English. But it was an emotional journey. I mean, trying to find friends, a new language. The Mexico School for the Deaf and the New Mexico community was very welcoming. There was a deaf club there that was a big support to our family, and I really have to thank my parents for making that sacrifice to move us here and for our education.
So we talked a little bit about Santa Fe. How about Horacio talks a little bit, did you go straight to Chicago or did you do other?
Actually, you know, my father came to the United States, I think the first time was around 1955, 56. And, you know, like many immigrants back then, they come by themselves and stay here by themselves and leave, you know, the family in Mexico. And I'm one of 11 children. I have 5 brothers and 5 sisters. And my brothers and sisters got their residency in 1970. Actually, that was the first year that I went back to school in Guadalajara in a residential school. And then all my brothers and sisters moved to Chicago in 1972. So for 1 year, I stayed by myself in Guadalajara. And later on, my parents decided that I should come with them to Chicago. And I want to say that it was not a very, it was a very difficult transition for me because I didn't speak English, because I was getting used to the school where I was at. I was very happy, a very happy child at that residential school for the blind. And when I got here in 1973, it was very difficult because my parents didn't know much about special education or services or programs for blind people. And one more time I stayed home like for 6 months without doing much because in 1973 there were not those many bilingual programs like now. You know, now you can go anywhere and you can hear people speaking Spanish everywhere. But back then, hardly you can find someone who speaks Spanish. So it was not an easy
Absolutely.
easy time. But I remember one time I met a blind man. Actually, my brothers saw a blind man crossing the tracks close where in my neighborhood, and they asked him. They told him, we have a brother who's blind, and he just came from Mexico, and we don't know where to take him to a school, what to do with him. And this man told us about the Headley School for the Blind. So what I did, we contacted the Headley School for the Blind, and I received an English course by mail, and I want to say that was the first my first contact with education in English. And then when I was ready to, when finally a social worker founded a school for me, a program at the high school. Actually, I think that was 9th grade. I had some English, but still it was kind of difficult, real difficult. And actually, I graduated from high school, and I still wanted to go back to Mexico because I didn't feel that I was. I feel that I was not independent as I was when I was in Guadalajara. So it was very difficult.
And yet, now you are an activist, you have a radio show, you're involved in the community.
Yeah, well,
There's things changed.
well, for good. And, I'm very grateful for what I have. And I love this country because not only for me, but for my 3 children and for my wife and my family. Probably I never would have that kind of life that I have in the United States. And I want to say that because I went back to Mexico in 1983, and after I finished school here at Whitewater College at Whitewater, Wisconsin, I went back to Mexico, and I was working as I was teaching at the same school where I was when I was, the school that I went, that residential school for blind children. And I got married in 1988. I met my wife at the same school where probably that's why I wanted to go back to Guadalajara, because I know I was going to meet my wife over there. So I met my wife, and then I went, as I said, I have 3 children. And in 1993, I came back to the United States, and I got involved at UIC with Dr. Fabricio Balcazar, who was here earlier. They had a project, I think that was empowering people with disabilities or building leaders, Latino leaders, and I took I was part of those trainings, and that's where I want to say that's where my advocacy and activism began here in Chicago. But and I started a support group for Latinos visually impaired, undocumented Latinos visually impaired that recently had that were losing their vision, and they didn't have access to any rehab or mobility and orientation or activity daily living skills. So I was doing that for on my own time, because back then my way of living was not completely in the disability movement. I had my own way of living through. I have been a musician all my life.
Oh.
So, but after that, in 1997, we decided to go back to Mexico. But a year later, right after we have moved, my son had a retinal detachment, and that's how we decided to come back to the United States. And I found this one wonderful organization that I'm working for right now, Progress Center for Independent Living, and another organization that was under the umbrella of Progress Center that is Not Dead Yet, that probably many of you know about that organization. And the executive director of Progress Center back then, her name Diane Coleman, she was the founder of Not Dead Yet, or NDY. And I remember they were looking for an independent living coordinator, and I want to say that that organization changed my life. And 7 years ago, Diane, who was the executive director, moved to New York, and she suggested that I should apply for, to take her place. And well, and I got the job. And I want to say that I'm very proud, because I'm not just the only blind person administrating a Center for Independent Living in Illinois, but I'm the first Latino running a Center for Independent Living in Illinois. So, and not that I'm proud because I'm feeding my ego, being the first Latino or the first blind person. That's not the thing. The thing is that if I can do it, anyone can do it. Thank you. I want to say, and I always tell young people, because my concern, I got involved 100% in the disability movement, not because I was looking for a job. I had my own way of surviving, of living. But when my son had a renal detachment, I thought that I have to do something, more for my children. But then after I would start thinking about my children, I thought about other young people that, or parents, like my parents, that don't know much about. They are facing, a new life and a new situation with a child with disabilities. There are so many challenges and barriers that my parents and I have to go through. So that's why I think advocacy and building leaders is so important, because, there are over, I think 50% of the population of people of the Hispanics or Latinos are people with disabilities. So I think it's a lot of work that Leticia and I and Renee and Conchita and many of us that we are here with disabilities, we have been very fortunate finding resources and programs. But let me tell you, there are so many people and parents that they don't even know about the ADA. Last Saturday, when we were celebrating the 25 years of the ADA in Chicago, and they were saying, we are celebrating the 25 years of the ADA, and I was thinking, yeah, those that we know about the ADA, we can celebrate, but still there are many things that we cannot celebrate. It's a long way to go. I was I was doing some interviews, and I asked, it was a mother in, at the parade, and I asked her, why are you here? She was not there because of the ADA. She was not there about the ADA. She said, I'm here because there are so many tables of information for, resources for my child who has autism. And I said, but do you know that if we are celebrating something else? She said, no, I don't know. I'm just coming for information. So we know about the American with Disabilities Act, but there are many people, they don't know about it. So for me, as a Latino, I have achieved my goals, my dreams. I have my own home, my own family. My oldest daughter, she graduated from Northwestern. She's working in Harlingen, Texas for Teach for America Foundation. My son, who had the renal detachment, he finished his bachelor's degree at UIC in pre-med, and now he's going to a medicine school in Mexico. He's on his 6th semester. And my youngest daughter, who had a renal detachment on both eyes, she's on her 3rd year on special education at Bloomington, Illinois. So I think if I have been able to raise my 3 children and they are successful, any person with disabilities can do it. And that's part of the activism and advocacy. And families should support their children to advocate and be independent and have self-determination.
Thank you. I too think...
I second that. I definitely agree.
Thank you.
When
I do think that that people should be trained to be advocates. It should be part of our education. And I wanted to ask Leticia, the New Mexico School for the Deaf, Galludet, the Deaf Latino Club in New Mexico, Mujeres de Color in Galludet. Could you discuss that transition to become an advocate on behalf not just of the community, but
Sure.
of Mujeres de Color?
If I could just go back to going to high school. There was something I didn't realize until I got much older. But in Spain, we were the only family in Mexico that I knew like ours. But then we came to New Mexico, we went to the School for the Deaf, I graduated, and then went to Galludet. And when I went to Galludet and I would meet Latino friends, many of them did not have a Latino identity. Many of them identified as white. And they told me that they want to make sure that they can have friends at Galludet who were white. This was in the early 1990s. And they didn't want to be part of that Latino experience. I wanted to set up a Deaf Latino club, and so I did. And people even today discuss the difference between Hispanic or Latino, but I was wanting to set up a club, an organization, to show pride in our shared culture. And it was hard to get people interested in that. I wanted to develop leaders who could then go back and work with children. So again, this is the early 1990s, and I worked with a friend of mine. Her name was Esme, and she had cerebral palsy. And I talked to her about, she brought up the ADA and going to the ADA signing, and I watched it, and I watched people sign the bill, and people were very excited. And at this point, I didn't really understand the impact of that. I was there and I saw what was going on, but I didn't really realize how important that was. I graduated from college, I traveled, and I came back in 2000, and I started working on campus at Galludet as an employee. And I was working at the elementary school, and I noticed so many families who were in need that were Latino. And I saw a huge change in just those 10 years. I thought that it was a good time to kind of bring back what my family used to do and have a fiesta and get together with families and talk to them about support. And we developed this organization where we would have Latino families get together from the local DC, Maryland, Virginia area for both deaf and hard of hearing kids who are from a Latino background. So we developed this organization, and I didn't do it alone. We were working together with another Peruvian man who works on campus. His name is Franklin, and also another Mexican woman who had a Mexican family. Her name's Elvira. So the three of us got together and founded this organization to support our local families who had deaf children who were Latino. And this really led to meeting many families who didn't know how to communicate with their children, because you use American Sign Language here. In Latin America, in every country, there's different sign languages, even though Spanish may be the universal spoken language. So in each of those, and then also spoken Spanish has its own dialects as well. So when we talked about civil rights with these families and talked to them about the issues that their children would face and really try to drum up support and activism, and still to this day, it's an issue. Now, I would see this happening. So we've got the larger Latino community, and then within that, we have women and women of color. So I was working with other people to co-found an organization to really work with deaf women of color, because again, we see these, even within the larger disability group or the larger deaf group and the Latino group, then these smaller pockets of people who also need support and services. And I look back at all of the time, like when I was brought to the ADA signing by Esme, my friend, and how I really didn't understand the impact, because now we can see we've got technology, we've got access to different places. You see people with disabilities being promoted into big positions. Dr. Robert Davila, who was the first deaf Latino president of Galludet University. I've talked to him and sat down and kind of picked his brain about what he sees with 25 years of the ADA. But really, I feel like has been mentioned, many families don't even know what the ADA is. They may have heard the term before, but they don't know what their rights that come along with that. The National Association of the Deaf has done some video blogs online to help to explain that. And I've done my own Facebook video blog to go out and talk to our community to see what their knowledge of the ADA is. I asked how many of you are familiar with the ADA, and I received, I don't know, how many responses you think? 5, 10, 100? Nope, I got 3. 3 responses from members of our own community who really understood what the ADA is. That's not good enough. I talked to, like I said, Dr. Davila, and he said an issue that we face is who can afford the computers, who can afford the internet access, who can afford to take time off to go to sign language classes to learn the language that their children are using. And I think that having that contact with parents is really important. So, right, the ADA is very important. I mean, now the Smithsonian's called me here to talk today on this panel, so it's all about spreading awareness, which is very important, and we need to continue to do that.
Thank you. Now, this panel is about activism, and so far it's been biographies, amazing biographies. I was wondering if you maybe could talk about an event or something that happened that and reflect on, sort of like what you did, what your organizations did, and what you would do differently, perhaps. So I was reading a book 2 days ago on the plane, and I ran across Horacio Fábregas' name at the beginning of a chapter. The book is Accessible Citizenships, and the epigraph was about Mr. Quinones?
Ojeda Jimenez?
Ojeda Jimenez, yes.
Quilino? Do you want to talk about that?
Yes.
Well, actually that, I didn't even know about that book, Jen. And I want to say that that was 2011, I believe, 2010. I received a call, that an immigrant undocumented who had was injured because he fell he was a roofer, and he ended with quadriplegia and very severe condition in the hospital. But the hospital decided to fly him back to Mexico. And the thing is that Quilino he didn't want to go to Mexico. He didn't sign, any consent to be discharged. And then the community, some community members from the town where he was native, they didn't want the hospital to send him back to Mexico. And they had a lot of conversations with the Mexican consulate. And when they called me, Quilino was already, he was already sent back to Mexico. And they were blaming the Mexican consulate, thinking that they were in agreement with the hospital to send them back, without having anything prepared, any arrangements in Mexico, if there was going to be any hospital, without any plan in Mexico. And Quilino always said, if I go back to Mexico, I'm going to die, which it happened. In 2012, he passed away. But the Mexican consulate, their argument was that they were not informed that Quilino was going to be sent out that day. So when a representative from the Mexican consulate came that evening, Quilino was already in the ambulance, in the helicopter ambulance to fly. So they couldn't do anything. The thing is that, sometimes the health system or hospitals, they violate all international alignments. I don't know what kind of agreements those kind of private ambulance services they have with airports or customs, to fly people back or send people, because it's not even deportation. Deportation is when immigration gets involved, but immigration was not involved. They just send them back. And the thing is that they send them to the border. I think that was Sonora, because I had a conversation with the director of the hospital where he ended in Oaxaca, Mexico, and he said he didn't come from the United States, he came from Sonora. So this kind of ambulance providers, what they do, they just fly him to the border and then, do whatever you want to do. And I remember when the Chicago Tribune interviewed me and called me asking me about Quilino, I said, they just threw him like garbage. Sorry, sounds bad, but that's what they did. And after I said that, and they published my words, my words in the newspaper, I started receiving a lot of phone calls threatening, saying that they were going to kill me. Some American people, they were not. They were upset for what I was saying, that I was defending or advocating for Quilino, saying, I need a kidney transplant, why don't you advocate for me too, and those kind of things. But the thing is that, I showed that Quilino, when he arrived in Oaxaca, he didn't have his ventilator, he didn't have other medical equipment that was provided here at the hospital. So that was not planned. Nothing was prevented, nothing was done to prevent anything that could happen to Quilino. And as he said, he was going to die, and he died in 2012. And I want to say that actually he passed away. He died probably about the same time that my father passed away, just around 12, I think 15 minutes after the New Year came. So I have that memory very clear in my mind. So that's how, the kind of activism that we do. But now we do activism, based on the need. I'm not here, if somebody comes and says, come on, get involved in this, I have to find out what's the need. For example, in 2006, and I think if you look on the internet, you can find articles about a long-term rehab center in Oak Forest, Illinois, that they closed that place. But when they were going to shut down, they found out that there were about over 30 undocumented residing in that long-term facility. And actually, one of them, Artemio Garcia, he had about 20 years residing at that nursing home. And he didn't want to go back to Mexico, of course, because many of them, they don't know, they didn't know how it would be living in Mexico or in any other countries with a disability. They were, like in Artemio's case, he came from a rural area. He was so scared, afraid, that his wheelchair was not even gonna, he was not gonna able to wheel in his native town. So they called me because they were 30 undocumented, and the health chief of the Cook County health director, he said on the media, on the newspapers, that it would be cheaper, easier to fly everybody back to their own countries than keep them in another rehab center. So that's when I started an advocacy plan with Commissioner Roberto Maldonado and other politicians and other leaders in the community to avoid the deportation. And finally, after so many meetings and protests and media got involved, those 30 undocumented were relocated in other rehab centers. And I want to say that even Artemio, if you look on the internet, you can see his story. He has probably about 30 years without seeing his parents. And he got quadriplegic 6 months right after he arrived in Chicago. He was in a store trying to buy something when he was shot. It was a robbery, and he, he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And Artemio became a good painter. He paints with his mouth. And he's a great artist, Actually, he has a lot of paints. Actually, the hospital, the Cook County Hospital in Chicago, they have a paint where he's drawing himself, thinking that he was dying, and like an angel flying. So it's a nice, and they have that paint at the hospital. And Artemio painted also gave us, Progress Center, he gave us a paint putting a wheelchair, the world on a wheelchair, reflecting, that all of us, we are part of this world. So, and that was a big, I'm gonna say that was my biggest victory in the activism, to stop those, that deportation of 30 undocumented being sent out when they were about to be deported. So, but activism is, you have to think about the needs of others, not about the political arena, not about the economical. Because I remember when going back to Quilino, I was interviewed in a radio show, and they were attacking me because I was defending him. And they were saying, well, why don't you pay for his hospitalization? Why do we have to pay? Our taxes are paying for all this undocumented. But one thing they don't know, that those undocumented contribute with taxes. There are millions of dollars in Social Security that they don't know what to do with it, because those undocumented cannot receive any refunds for such taxes. So what do they do with that? Now, as Fabrizio said earlier, when the reporter was asking me, why should we pay for this person? There are many people in the United States who are residents, who are citizens, and they are sick, they need medical assistance. And I said, well, I'm not advocating thinking on money. I'm not advocating thinking on the human side. And I was, Fabrizio mentioned this earlier. I asked the reporter, if you are driving on the street and you see someone dying in the middle of the road, what's your first reaction as a human being? You're not thinking, oh, I'm not gonna pay for this person. I'm not gonna, how is he undocumented or he's not, or he's documented? Who's gonna pay for it? You don't think of that. Your first reaction as a good person, as a good human being, is to assist and help. So why later on, when after, you have to think about that. So that's, and I think the activism that we do is thinking on the human being, not on the other part.
Thank you. Leticia, any events or actions that you'd like to share and reflect on?
Are you asking?
So there is
No,
a
Ms.
nonprofit
Leticia.
organization that had been doing some work, and it was quite a laborious involvement. The company itself was a nonprofit, and so they didn't feel like they could afford some of the things that they needed to be doing, even though there were some advocacy groups working for them, telling them that they needed to do some things in the right way. So some of the funding was getting drawn down and used in another way, and ultimately was supporting folks back in Peru. And part of the reason that they were doing that was because there was a lack of parity of services between the people that lived here versus there. So it was kind of, trying to make things happen in a certain way. We had to, go to the boss itself and get them to understand what was going on. They were trying to realize that the funding wasn't necessarily getting wasted on families per se, but it was being funded for somebody who was actually dealing with brain cancer. And it was something that if they had known before would have been sort of a non-issue. And it was a month or two later, I think it was pretty close to the time when that person passed away back in Peru, a friend of mine, they wanted to be taken back to Peru to be buried. And sort of similar to like what you were saying, this whole situation sort of manifested in creating a grassroots advocacy and activism. And it was something that had to keep going in an ongoing basis, because we may have like those things that spark the fire and start something that occurs, but frequently they're things that have to just keep working on over time, over and over again. And that was a lesson that I learned from that particular situation.
Thank you, Leticia. How, when you're doing your activism, how much of it is rooted in the deaf community? How much of it is rooted or trying to change or working with people outside of, I guess, deaf communities?
I'd let Leticia go first.
Yes.
And that's a question for me.
Sí, for you.
Well, the world that I work with is primarily based at Galludet. So there's a lot of deaf folks there, quite a few who are in the audience, but there are hearing folks as well. I mean, everyday life does focus a lot on the deaf community, but it really doesn't matter. If somebody has the capacity to use sign language, that's great. If not, we do need to sort of change some perspectives on that people realize that we can have a meeting of the minds, that sign language doesn't mean that a person is less capable of that sort of communication. And it's something that you see a lot in the interactions with the hearing world. They sort of have this expectation that we meet them where they are in their language rather than them meeting us in where we are in our language. And we talk about things like signing impaired versus hearing impaired, for example, like those sorts of ideas. And we want to have it be open and convivial. We want to be met in our place and in our space. So when I think those Latino organizations that are out there, like La Raza here, might maybe show some resistance to interpretation or offering interpretation. And even now in 2015, we still deal with that struggle. We have to find ways to work collaboratively together to change those perspectives, which is not always easy. And those expectations may be difficult to overcome. It's true that I take it for granted that I'm at Galludet every day, working with deaf folks and navigating the waters of the deaf world quite easily, but that doesn't exist everywhere. And even though we see people making great strides in the deaf world and the deaf community, we have to also think about how that might overlap with Latino organizations and how they can collaborate successfully together to bring that success forward.
Thank you. Horacio?
Well, 10 years ago, because it's kind of difficult, because there are so many barriers for the Latino community to have access to services and programs. And I didn't know what to do, because the center I work for, the Center for Independent Living, probably just 5% of our staff are Latinos. And it was kind of difficult how to provide services and programs, how to do advocacy, how to get the community involved, because the language, because the culture. And I thought, I thought about media and transportation barriers transportation is another obstacle for people to come and participate or in, physical organizations, or families don't have time to take them. So I thought about having a radio show. I said, well, if they cannot come, I can bring the information through a radio show. And for many years, I had a radio show about other topics, entertainment, and I thought that maybe, that little that I know about radio, I can apply it or implement it in the disability movement. And I started with a 1 hour radio show, and then 2 hours, and then in a radio station in Chicago that was not a very popular Spanish radio show. But then later on, Univision gave me the opportunity to have that radio show with them. And so far, this May, I completed 10 years with the radio show. And that's the way I invite people to get involved in the disability, in the advocacy or activism, in the disability movement.
Thank you.
Also, we have the issue of trilingual interpreters as well, interpreters who can do English, spoken Spanish, and sign language. And that's something, is there anybody in the audience even who has something like that? Could I bring, yes, okay, could I bring somebody up here and help them answer your question in regards to that? A trilingual?
Is there a trilingual
Can you add
interpreter?
that comment? Yeah? Well, what I'm looking for is some advice about, as a deaf person and a blind person, how it is that they can interface with trilingual services to try to improve their interfaces with the public for education, et cetera, especially for children in the public school system. I have to say that education is not exactly my bailiwick, but I mean, there may be somebody here who's better suited to answer your question. Admittedly, I think that we have to focus a lot more on the needs of public services, not just education, but public services in general, even something like driver's education and transportation issues. That's certainly a need. We have a lot of fear around the independent education plans, parents not knowing what to do, not understanding the legal jargon of those documents, and feeling like those documents are a way to get something over on them. There's a lot of fear, I think, about that process, but I'm going to call out a couple of my friends here in the audience. Is there anything you wanted to add on that? None? Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry I'm not suited to answer that. But does that kind of speak to what you were saying?
Yes, thank you. The other thing I think there's a paradox where Latinos are more present than ever, but the discussion around Latinos in public is very limited. Like, it's about immigration. And not about other situations. And I was wondering, as Latinos, actually, how has immigration affected your work recently, in the last 10 years? Well, and I think Horacio wants to answer this question, and then Leticia.
Well, in 2006, and the activists, the immigration reform activists, they just talk about immigrations and reform and citizen or residency or get a legal status, but they just think in general, but they don't think there are groups with different needs. In 2006, actually that was about the same time that those over 30 undocumented at that long-term care were, struggling or being concerned if they will be deported. Then I thought that I should get involved in those organizing big marches that we had in Chicago. And in March 13, the first one, I remember, I invite people with disabilities, and I had a contingent, probably about 60 or 80 people walking with us, and I was one of the speakers at the protest, and saying, that immigrants with disabilities should be included in any immigration reform. And I remember the media next day saying, and even people with disabilities came out to protest, but they were not thinking about us as a group. They were just thinking like, when they came out too. But then I called the media and I told them, you know what, it's not just people with disabilities. We are a group that we have different needs. There are many people with disabilities that they have so many years without being working, and in case of any immigration reform, they might not qualify because they are not going to be able to prove that they have worked for the last 5 or 6 years. So the next march that was in May 1st, that was the biggest one, that we had over 500,000 people protesting in Chicago. The media came and they were looking for us to interview each of us, and they were, articles written about us, the TV were, because now at that second protest, they looked at us as a group with some needs, not just immigrants, but other kind of group. And that's what you're saying, John. They talk about everything, but not about, the needs of people with disabilities. And same thing with those that are coming from Central America, trying to get to the United States on the Beast and La Bestia, the train. They talk about immigrants, and they get amputated, they get disabilities, on the way, but they never say, oh, what kind of things, services, programs, what do they need after that? So, and I think we, the Latino leaders or Latinos working in the disability movement, we need to spread the word. We need to speak up. We need to be more visible and work closer with the media. I think the media is so important. The media can change your image for good or for bad, and mostly it's for bad, because the way the media present stories about people with disabilities are like pity, like charity, but not with dignity, not with the real need. I have seen, for example, in some Spanish television saying, oh, this family or this person needs a wheelchair because poor person, he's just rolling on the floor. But they don't talk about, they don't present the story with dignity. It's not just the wheelchair. It's not just the money to buy the wheelchair. So I think that's where we need to build that relationship with the media. That will make a big change in our lives.
Leticia.
Wow. I'm thinking I want to say it was in 2005. We had this DEF-CAN organization, and that was something that really started to raise awareness about the things that we could do. And we were looking at people who were already citizens, but that needed to reach out to like the National Association of the Deaf and other organizations and whatnot. We actually had a hard time finding some of the people that we needed to be able to offer them assistance, and it was difficult for people to even know how to navigate the system right from the very ground up. And so when you're talking about the issue of immigration and you're overlapping that with the issue of being a person who is deaf, that's an incredibly difficult situation to be in, because in the Latino world, it's difficult to start with to occupy that space. The first parade that you referenced and we're talking about, it was actually something that was really exciting to come here and see what was going on. And for me, I came here with that mission of trying to find where deaf people were and where the interpreters might be. And there was a paucity of that. There was just basically me, and I was wondering where everybody was. You know, I'm there, I'm present, and I didn't know like who I could even reach out to say, hey, do you have interpreters? Where are the interpreters? What's the situation here? And so I think for the next time, I'm going to get a little louder about that, trying to figure out how it is that I can then bring that organization to the deaf Latino population, looking forward into 2017. Did you want to add another comment to that? Yeah, come on. Hello, my name is Deli, and I wanted to add a little bit to what you're saying. We're cousins, but you know, I work at the university as well, and I've been working with Latinos and Black students. And one of the students came in and was wanting to talk about the DREAM Act and was talking about the issues that they were having with their credentials expiring and wanting to get that to continue so that they could continue with college. And at that time, I was aware of the DREAM Act, but I wasn't familiar with all the particulars. And so that person, that gave us the opportunity to really expand our exposure on that piece of legislation and the work that is associated with that so that they could get their credentials in order and continue to do their studies in school. But it was really interesting because with Galludet, even though it's a well-known place, advocacy is a rich part of our culture and communication access exists. When you start talking about like physical accessibility issues, which are more like the DREAM Act, then we suddenly find ourselves not knowing the answer to the process, to know exactly how to handle things. And we found ourselves a little bit flat-footed figuring out what to do with that. But we did try our best. We tried a lot of different ways to offer assistance to that student and keep her in school. But she went through a very tough time. And I really have to applaud the effort and the energy that she put into it and keeping a positive frame of mind so that we would get everything sorted out for another 5 years. But that was something that really resonated with me about what the bigger picture is and immigration issues in particular, because we're talking about things like the DREAM Act and undocumented students and the communication issue. It's very multi-layered. That's true. There's another comment in the back. I actually have a question for both of the panelists, for Leticia and the gentleman, Horacio.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Oh.
Well, what I'm looking at, what I'd like to ask about is STEM issues, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And I know the goal is to try and increase the diversity of people that are in those fields learning STEM-related topics. And we're talking about all kinds of diversity, hearing, deaf, race, national origin, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the questions that I have about that is the issue of people who are blind, because we've had that in terms of communication issues. So Mobility International, for example, which is a disability group for folks, had the issue of a blind gentleman from Mexico. And teaching this person was an issue. We were trying to do it directly, that there weren't intermediary communication services involved, but that it could be direct. And it was very challenging. So for us in our environment, having a blind person involved was a challenge, and we found that an interpreter was our solution, but not the one that we desired. So I kind of was wondering what your thoughts were on that and what the best way would be to communicate.
Horacio, then Leticia.
Yeah. I let Leticia first.
Okay.
Well, I think that's more for you. You want me to answer? Okay.
Yeah, I wanna know how you do it.
I think
there.
you really, Gabriel, you really wanted him to, oh, you want both of us to answer. Okay, all right. Well, I have to kind of go back to the question itself. You're talking about a Latino deaf business owner. I mean, you're talking about a unicorn right there. There's not really a whole lot of people out there that can do that, and so there isn't necessarily going to be, I think, an answer. And we all need to work together to build the capacity to elevate the ability to interface with that. And I think if you're dealing with a blind person, I don't have the knowledge on that, so I would defer to Horacio for that.
Well, I want to say that, you know, for me, to be, you know, to be independent as a blind person, especially centers for independent living, they were more focused or working with people with mobilities. And in Mexico, I never would have all the resources that I have here, and I think that you know, family is so important, and blind people, we have more opportunities with the assistive technology and the things that we have now that we never had. I wish I could have all those tools or that technology 40 years ago.
One, oh,
Can I answer the question? So, this is Conchita. There's a lot of different ways for blind people to do math and science in the STEM field. And there's actually a young gentleman in California who does camps for blind kids to get them like participating fully. So I'm not sure if your question was like how blind people do STEM or how they would communicate with a deaf individual. But if it was like with STEM, there's like technology, but there's also a lot of really simple, not technology, big technology, but like really low-tech technology that gets them kind of to do, for us, to do math and science. And I can give you more information on that later.
Do you use assistive technology too, right?
Say that again?
Do you use assistive technology too, right?
Yes.
Okay. And did you live in Mexico before, or you?
I did, yeah, I lived in Mexico.
Right. And you know, I would assistive technology is so expensive for people like living in Mexico and Latin America. It's not easy to have access to assistive technology, and actually, in some schools for blind children in Mexico or Latin America, they still use, you know, the slate and the stylus, and they still handwriting, the braille. In the United States, I want to say that, rarely blind people read or write braille, because now we have all this kind of technology. But the thing is that, you know, the different programs that we have in resources provide us with that assistive technology. In my case, like when I started working for Progress Center, the Bureau for the Blind Services provided me like with probably around $8,000 of technology, you know, to accommodate my job so that I can, you know, perform my job. In Mexico, you never would get that. So it's a big difference between, you know, the technology for blind people in those countries and blind people here. I think we have all the opportunities in the world to succeed.
This is the Smithsonian. This is the National Museum of American History, and we're closing. And it's supposed to be everybody's museums. But my question for the two of you, and I'd like Leticia to answer it first, and then Horacio, is what 3 objects or pieces of paper would you like to see in this museum to tell the story of the last 25 years for Latinos and the ADA?
Objects? So you're talking about things to put in the museum here? Ooh. Well, I guess if I had my druthers, I know they're setting up the African American History and Culture Museum next door. So really what I'd like to see is a deaf museum. I want an entire thing. So that's it. I want the whole thing. You know, and of course the museum would have, and it would encompass its own diversity surrounding deafness, but I mean, that's what I have to say. I want the whole thing.
Horacio, in a museum, what would you like to experience to tell the story of Latinos and disability for the last 25 years, recent history?
For the last 25 years?
Or from your...
Well, first, if I can see, that paper in Spanish, so I think...
So you come into the museum and you hear La Vida Independiente in the
right,
background?
in Spanish, then Conchita doesn't have to be translating for, the people that need that translation. So for me, it's Spanish, but also, that everybody count, that all of us, we are equal, and hope, this story that in the future we can say, all immigrants or people with disabilities, Latino with disabilities, immigrants with disabilities, have been included in any change for good in this country.
Well,
I'd like to add, oh, sorry. I just want to add one quick comment. When you're talking about the ADA itself, if you go on Google and you look at, translate to Spanish, it's not really there very much. It would be nice if we had a Spanish translation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I think it's fantastic that we were invited here today to talk about these issues and to look back on the ADA, so I want to thank you sincerely for that.
well, I think that'll conclude, but first I want to say I'm so happy to see so many, deaf people and people from Galludet. It's wonderful to see you all here. Thank you for coming, and thank you, panelists. This is amazing. And we'll hang around if there are any other questions, if you want to meet the panelists. And I will say that Manny Hernandez is storytelling right now out on the terrace. He has about 20 more minutes of storytelling in ASL. And there are a lot of things the next 2 days inside and outside the building, so please come back and join us. Follow us on social media. So thank you all.
Thank you.